So this is my first ever video where I'm discussing a MMA or a UFC fight. As you guys know, boxing's my sport, but this Conor McGregor has become an individual who you can't miss. If I ever log on to my Facebook, if I ever log on to my Twitter, if I ever read a newspaper, his face is everywhere at present. He's become a crossover star, and people have heard of him regardless of whether they're boxing fans, MMA fans, UFC fans, whatever. So, I've seen a few of his fights with interest from the sidelines, and he went in to fight Nate Diaz last night. I didn't stay up to watch the fight. I've rewatched it this morning, and to be honest, without knowing and without having analysed it in too much depth, one would have suspected that Conor McGregor would have won the fight. I assume he was a overwhelming favourite. I understand Diaz came in as a late replacement, and Conor McGregor was expected to move up in weight and to win in style. The fight didn't quite play out that way. As you guys know, if you watched this video by now, Conor McGregor looked pretty poor to my eye, en route to being stopped by submission in the second round. Now, I wanted to discuss a few of the keys to victory that I saw in this fight, having watched it back. In essence, I wanted to pick up on a few areas that I think were instrumental in the victory for Diaz and the loss to McGregor. I don't think to analyse this fight you necessarily need to be an expert in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I think a lot of the fundamentals that were on show and a lot of the fundamentals that were missing here can be discussed from a general combat sport fan perspective, if you like. So let's start with the weight, because I know this is an area that's been discussed endlessly. So McGregor has fought in the past at 145 pounds. In boxing terminology, somewhere between light welterweight and welterweight. This fight was at 170 pounds, so somewhere between super middleweight and light heavyweight. So obviously that's an absolutely massive jump, a massive jump. And there was a large amount of discussion as to whether somebody like Conor McGregor would be able to make the move up to 170 pounds. I guess, to go back to boxing terminology, that's the equivalent of Manny Pacquiao moving up to fight Sergey Kovalev. It's not a fight that you would anticipate seeing. And I personally felt there was too much emphasis placed on Conor McGregor's weight. How would Conor McGregor look at 170 pounds? I think Conor McGregor at 170 pounds was one thing to consider, but I think the dramatically different opponent was the bigger factor. So Conor McGregor's most famous victory to date was Jose Aldo, who, looking at Aldo, I know he's pound for pound number one previously. I know he's a hugely experienced, skilled campaigner, but if you look at him, he was a substantially smaller man than McGregor. And if you put Jose Aldo next to Nate Diaz last night, that is what Conor McGregor was contending with, that jump. I don't think we should necessarily be discussing how Conor McGregor looked from 145 to 170. I think we should be saying, compare Jose Aldo with Nate Diaz and look at the different size and the different challenge that they therefore presented. And I think that was absolutely key. For me, in this fight, Conor McGregor's work, his stand-up boxing, was lacking. We've seen Conor McGregor fight before, and he is a snappy fighter. He seems to carry a lot of punching power. People were amazed how quickly he took Jose Aldo out. He seemed to be a real dynamic, strong puncher. And for me, one of the real problems for him in this fight was the range. Actually finding his range against Diaz. This was a key issue for him. And let's not forget that moving up 2 weight classes in MMA is a lot different to moving up 2 weight classes in boxing, because the weight classes in MMA are so much wider. There's 15 pounds in a weight class difference, not 7 pounds. So it's not just the weight, it's actually the size of a man, his reach, his length. And I thought Conor McGregor really struggled with the range of Diaz yesterday. I think that this kind of created inaccuracy. I guess for a lot of his fights at 145, Conor McGregor's used to being a taller, rangier, lengthier individual, and Last night that wasn't the case, and what he found is that a lot of his shots were actually out of range, which in turn obviously created some inaccuracy. I think the other thing, because McGregor was the smarter boxer out of the two in the first round, the other thing is it's not that Conor McGregor has suddenly become a weak puncher overnight, but it's how physically draining and mentally draining it is to be landing haymakers on an opponent, and it just not to be having the same effect on them, whatsoever. And again, that's something that we see in all combat sports when people change weight classes. Think of an example off the top of my head. Arthur Abraham, known as a massive puncher at middleweight in boxing, steps up in weight class, and suddenly the reign of knockouts comes to a close. And that's something that was very relevant in this fight. I thought McGregor was loading up with his shots. He was trying to land a classier, more eye-catching work, but his punches just didn't hurt. Diaz in the same way that he'd been hurting opponents in the lower weight classes. And I think that became draining for Conor McGregor. I felt he was loading up on his work too much. And yeah, that was probably one of the reasons why his stamina started to sap relatively early on in this fight. Because make no mistake, McGregor's a fantastically conditioned individual. I guess when you're fighting someone that big as well, when there's the size difference is so vast compared to the level of opponent you've been fighting in the past, it's also very physically draining when you're up close. And I know this was a fight that was largely fought at range, but even brief moments in the fight where you're wrestling with an opponent, where you're holding an opponent, it can be extremely physically draining when someone's got that sort of weight advantage on you. So that was another relevant factor. So for me, McGregor, whilst theoretically would be fine with the move up in weight class, it was all of these different factors coming together at the same time, which meant it wasn't a good idea for him. It was not judging the range, it was perhaps becoming frustrated when his power punches weren't having the same effect as previously. It was perhaps being worn out just by being in and moving around with a man who was so much bigger than the guys you're used to fighting, like Jose Aldo. The other thing I must say about Conor McGregor, and as I say, this was a surprise to me as someone who isn't an MMA fan, really, but the other thing that was surprising to me was the defensive frailties of Conor McGregor. I mean, I don't know, people, you tell me, is he normally open like this? But the hands were so low. He was really asking to be hit, and I was actually amazed how long it did take Nate Diaz to connect on him. The defence was not tight whatsoever. And if you're going to rely on using stand-up striking against a guy who is a lot bigger than you, one of the obvious things is keeping your hands high and not trying to engage in a sort of brawl in the pocket, if you like. For me, when Conor McGregor eventually took several punches on the chin for Nate Diaz, he looked in trouble. Look, he wasn't knocked out, he wasn't knocked down. McGregor's a very tough campaigner and deserves credit. But for me, he looked in a bit of trouble 30 seconds before the stoppage when Diaz was starting to hit on him. He looked very, very drained. And he, for me, was not fighting on instinct at that point. He was maybe not knowing what to do 100% when he got fully clocked by Nate Diaz, the much bigger man, and he resorted to trying to take down and trying to wrestle with a guy who had advantages in that area. So for me, that wouldn't have happened. If he'd been clocked by a guy there who was weighing 155, not 170, would he have panicked and, as a result, sort of made a move that was so poor from a chess player's perspective? Would you try and take down the jiu-jitsu guy? For me, it seemed like an ill thought out move, and came about as a result of being physically drained, came about as a result of being frustrated and hurt and not knowing what to do in that situation. All in all, what I'm saying is if you're going to move up in weight class, it's sometimes not the obvious things that find you out. It's not necessarily who can hit the hardest. It's not necessarily who's the quickest. It's things like judging reigns and the impact, the physically draining impact of seeing your punches not dropping people like you're used to. And for me, that found Conor McGregor out last night. And it's a great shame for UFC as a sport, because he was building such an image, such a reputation. And don't get me wrong, of course he can come again. But I guess his persona of being this outrageous, dominating individual is somewhat cracked from this fight, which is a big loss to the UFC. It's a big loss to him personally. Diaz, obviously, is a late notice opponent. He said in a post-fight press conference that he'd done no sparring. He'd only had a 2-week camp. You know, it's not a good loss for McGregor to take. For me, maybe £155 would be a more sensible option for him than 170. Let me know your thoughts. Did you enjoy this fight? Feel free to comment on my breakdown. As I say, it's my first MMA video ever, so I don't expect it to tick all the boxes. There's probably some obvious stuff I've missed. Please comment if I've missed some obvious stuff. Let me know if you've liked it. Let me know if you'd like to see more of these type of videos in the past. Hit the thumbs up button. Please subscribe to the channel. Many thanks for watching, guys.